Hello and welcome to Module 8 of Training and Retaining Great Teachers. And our focus in this model is really on teacher retention. And we're going to be thinking about workload and working environment. And we're also going to take a slight detour to have a look at the early career framework. So this is how it fits in with the programme. We've gone through all of these meetings here and we are here at Module 8. This is our penultimate session and we'll meet again for Module 9 after Easter. So I'm going to be referring to these pieces of evidence throughout this session, and all of these are available for you to read in the Google Drive. So we've got various reports on teacher working conditions, teacher workload, the early career framework, teacher autonomy and how that relates to job satisfaction and retention, the DfE's teacher recruitment and retention strategy, and we're going to have a look at one chapter in particular from this book, which is really interesting. So the current picture around teacher recruitment and retention, and I say current, this is from a House of Commons briefing paper from 2019. In recent years, the overall number of teachers has not kept pace with increasing pupil numbers. Overall, pupil numbers are expected to rise. The number of full-time equivalent qualified teachers recorded as leaving the state-funded sector for reasons other than retirement was 35,800 in 2017. And that's gone up from 24,750 in 2011 when the current series starts. So we've got more teachers leaving, pupil numbers growing. And workload, government policy and lack of support from leadership have been cited as the three main reasons for leaving in a survey of ex-teachers. The government has noted workload as the most frequently cited reason for teachers wanting to leave the profession, and in response to questions about teacher retention has highlighted its efforts to reduce workload so that teachers can concentrate on teaching rather than bureaucracy. So this is from similar report, and again around factors affecting retention. Amongst the findings of this research was that workload was the most important factor influencing teachers' decisions to leave the profession. But it also found that decisions to leave the profession were driven by the accumulation of a number of factors over a sustained period of time. And suggested solutions for retention include improving in-school support for teachers, increasing focus on progression opportunities, reducing workload, improving working conditions, including flexible working, professional recognition and greater autonomy. And we're going to have a little look at each of these. Important to say that before this year, the targets for teacher recruitment had also been missed for the last 4 years. Things are very different this year. It'll be really interesting to see how increased numbers of applications to initial teacher training programmes, how that plays out over the next few years. So in the teacher recruitment and retention strategy, and you can find this whole document and a one-page summary in the Google Drive, there are 4 main barriers to retention that are cited. The first of these is around workload. And that workload is really clearly linked here with accountability systems. So that idea that the demands of Ofsted and of league tables lead to some excessive workload demand. So I'm just suggest you're going to pause here and have a read of this slide. And those suggestions for the new Ofsted framework. And I will say from personal experience, my school, Charles Dickens Primary School, had an Ofsted inspection in September 2019 under the new framework. And most of our staff were asked about workload and what the school did to support teachers' workload. So that is work that we are seeing coming through in practice as well. The second barrier is around the support that early career teachers receive to build a foundation for a successful career. We know that we have large numbers of teachers leaving in the first few years of their career. And this is really this evidence is really what sits behind the early career framework. And we're going to have a little look at that in a minute. But do pause here if you want to read that slide in greater detail. And then thinking back to some of those comments in that first piece of research from the DfE, a career in teaching does not always adapt to the expertise and lives of 2 teachers, And this really brings together two separate things. One is around flexible working in school. As people's lives change, perhaps they have children or their caring responsibilities change. And the other is around pursuing a variety of, or offering a variety of career paths and different progression opportunities. And again, we can see the link here between more opportunities for diverse career paths and the introduction of the reformed MPQs. And then the final barrier to successful recruitment and retention is identified as the process to become a teacher, so initial teacher training. And of course, we're awaiting publication of the government's review into ITT, which should be published in June or July this year. So these are the things we're going to look at, the factors influencing teacher retention. We're going to look at that early career support. And then we're going to look at that broader basket of working environment. And sitting within the working environment, we're going to consider workload, supportive leadership, behaviour, autonomy, and flexible working. So all of those themes that teachers have reported as the key reasons if they've left a profession prior to retirement. So we're going to start by looking at early career teachers. So I'd like you to pause and read this slide. And we can see that that's obviously a worrying statistic. Over 20% of new teachers leave the profession within their first 2 years of teaching, and 33% leave within their first 5 years. And so this sits behind the introduction of the early career framework to give a far stronger support system to early career teachers. So the early career framework is a centrally designed curriculum which sets out what all early career teachers should learn about and learn how to do during the first 2 years of their career. And it's a 2-year training and support entitlement for newly qualified teachers and their in-school mentors. So it's two things. We're now saying we have a 2-year programme of really carefully structured support for our early career teachers. And that sits hand in hand with a more formal statutory role for in-school mentors. And also the content of that support has been centrally designated through the specification of the early career framework. Now, the early career framework is aligned to the teacher's standards. And for each of those standards, we have 2 separate sets of statements. The first is what teachers should know. So teachers should learn that. These criteria were developed with the Education Endowment Foundation and have a very strong evidence base. Then we think about, well, what does that mean about how teachers work? They should therefore, because of these statements, which we can be really quite secure about them having a really strong evidence base, they should learn how to, and these statements are drawn from a wider evidence base, sort of beyond the really, really robust evidence that we have, research evidence here. So this example is the section around how pupils learn, which links with Standard 2, promoting good progress. Early career teachers should learn that learning involves a lasting change in pupils' capabilities or understanding, so thinking about that learning over time. Prior knowledge plays an important role in how pupils learn. And then we link that with the learn how to avoid overloading working memory by taking into account pupils' prior knowledge when planning how much new information to introduce. So a really helpful framework. This isn't directly linked to retention, but I think it's really worth flagging up schools' options for the early career framework. It's very timely at the moment. Schools are having to make decisions about this. They've got 3 options. The first is to use their own materials and facilitate their own sessions. So taking the early career framework, developing their own curriculum and in-house facilitation. The second is to take the core materials that have been centrally designed, so a fleshed out curriculum available on the .gov.uk website, but facilitating their own sessions. And the third is to access a fully funded training programme via a delivery partner. So that might be your local teaching school hub, local authority, or a large MAT. This is fully funded, and it's also worth saying that additional funding comes with those schools choosing to access the fully funded programme for release time for your mentors to receive training as well. And so here we've got a summary of the differences between the current arrangements to support NQTs and the new arrangements, the new statutory induction arrangements from September 2021. And worth flagging that this is applicable to all early career teachers regardless of their initial teacher training route. So the support is going from 1 year to 2 years. And we can see that there are changes in the timetable reduction, so an additional or a continuing timetable reduction in year 2. And we're moving from no defined content to induction clearly based on the early career framework. And again, we can see the real beefing up of this support from a designated mentor. And although we know that most schools will have had an in-school mentor, it's that really clear specification to provide consistency across the system. And you can see here the summary of the assessment, the funding, the pay, and the role of the appropriate body as well. So in terms of options open to schools, in terms of finding a delivery partner if they don't want to facilitate their own sessions, delivery partners have chosen one of these 6 organisations to partner with. And these organisations have all developed their own curriculum, their own structured way of delivering the early career framework over 2 years. And so it's really incumbent upon schools to work out which lead providers and which delivery partners they want to work with. So I'd really suggest you do a bit of research around that. As I say, not directly applicable to this session today, but a really important little sort of tangent to go off on, I think. So that's the early career support, that's this bit. And if we can get that right, and the early career framework seems to be a really good step in that direction of designating central content, increasing that induction period to 2 years, and really ensuring there's really strong in-school support, then that's going to be hopefully really firm foundations upon which we can base our retention strategies. But we're now going to look at the importance of the different aspects of working environment and what those mean. So when we talk about working environment, we're talking about the policies and shared ways of working that are within the proximal influence of school leadership and which affect teachers' ability to fulfil their job roles. This Sims and Jerem paper, the Tallis study, is in the Google Drive and we'll be referring to it throughout. So looking at the evidence base, can we tell which aspects of the working environment matter most? Well, the evidence base seems to be strongest for these 3 aspects. For supportive leadership, strong behaviour policies, and workload and compliance. So just flicking back to behaviour policies, those actions taken by both staff and leadership to prevent or intervene with unwanted behaviours, not just are unwanted behaviours present. And then those questions around workload and compliance, the need to go out of one's way in order to follow a procedure imposed by a superior. So we're not really talking about the number of hours worked, we're talking really more about proportionality, is the amount of time spent on tasks proportionate with their impact, and purposefulness as well, is that a good use of teachers' time? So we know that working environment has a really important influence on teacher retention, in particular the supportive leadership and the behaviour policy, and we've got some references you can follow up, and again those are in the Google Drive. But before we look closely at those, I also want to share with you this, which is around the working environment and teacher effectiveness and teacher retention. So we know that working environment is correlated very highly with effective teacher retention. And we know that schools with strong teacher retention have higher progress scores as well. So we can see there that there's a real correlation between the working environment and outcomes for pupils, working environment and teacher effectiveness. There's greater detail here. It is from the American context, but some really interesting research around that link between teacher effectiveness and working environment. And taken from this paper, if we think about both leadership and management and discipline and behaviour, so that 2 of those aspects of the working environment that we know have a strong impact on retention. And we can see how closely that this is plotted. So we've got two lines. One is for our novice teachers and one is for our more experienced teachers. And where leadership and management have a lower score, we can see that there's a far higher probability, especially for our new teachers, of teacher turnover, of teachers leaving those schools. There's a similar pattern, though the numbers are lower, when we think about this discipline and behaviour in schools. We can see that the more negative scores on discipline correlate really quite strongly with the higher probability of a teacher leaving their school. We can then look at very similar charts around leaving the profession, so losing those teachers out of the profession altogether. And again, for leadership and management and discipline, the weaker the discipline or the weaker the ratings of the leadership and management, the higher probability, especially for novice teachers, that they will leave the profession entirely. And again, you can do a bit more digging around that data in this report here from 2020. Really important to think, well, okay, well, what were those scores? We saw these scores along the x-axis. What do they mean? Well, the leadership and management score is composed of a number of questions. Is there a supportive culture within the school? Do managers recognise teachers for doing a good job? Do teachers have a chance to participate in decision making? And are teachers given the autonomy necessary to do their job? So there's something around a supportive culture, around being appreciated and recognised for doing a good job. So that will be around communication skills and around acknowledging really good work. A sort of a participative and collaborative decision-making process in the school, and around autonomy. And we're going to look at a bit of evidence around autonomy a bit later. And then thinking further about behaviour and what that discipline score is composed of. These are the questions that were asked. Do staff in the school consistently enforce behaviour standards? And we know that from the evidence, the impact of morale of inconsistent enforcing of behaviour, especially in a secondary context, it's incredibly challenging for the students to understand what are the rules that they're meant to be following, and can be really demoralising for staff as well. Are teachers able to control disruptive behaviour? And then that will be around the institutional supports and that consistency. And to what extent do teachers experience verbal or physical abuse? So really worth thinking about our own context. So these questions that we do need to ask our staff if we have high levels of turnover, are these some questions that would be helpful to pursue either in our leadership teams or with our wider staff body? So we're going to move on to think about workload. This is something I'm personally very interested in. I've been involved in two quite significant to me, certainly, projects around workload. I would say this is certainly my finding from the research that I've been involved in, and that has been backed up by wider research, that workload reduction strategies have led to improved outcomes. This was a project that I was involved in around reducing written marking in primary schools in Southwark and South London. There's a little booklet that's got the practical applications of that project, so you can click on that and have a look if you'd like to pursue that further. That was around 2016-17. And then another report which was published just as we were going into lockdown, really, which was looking at wider teacher workload reduction strategies using the Workload Reduction Toolkit. If you haven't come across the Workload Reduction Toolkit, it's a suite of resources available on the .gov.uk website. So if you Google it, it should come up. And it breaks teacher workload down into lots of different categories, so marking, behaviour, planning, communications within the school. And it's got lots of case studies and further reading and tools, really useful tools for schools to run staff meetings or evaluation strategies. So this was the teacher workload survey from 2016 to 17. It was repeated then a couple of years ago, but this is the picture. And I think what's one of the really interesting things here about workload is how consistent it is across primary and secondary, and that we've got three big areas that leap out at us as, you can see from the red key, as being too much. I spend too much time doing this. We've got lesson planning, we've got marking, and we've got general administrative work. So again, really worth thinking about policies around especially planning and marking work if retention is an issue, and making sure that the time we're asking teachers to spend on those tasks is proportional with the impact that they're having. So these are some of the outcomes from the project I named with a little booklet. And you can see that there were groups of schools across the country all working on reducing written marking. And you can see that they all sort of did very similar things and across a range of settings. So you've got primaries, secondaries, special, another cluster of secondaries and nurseries. I'm not quite sure how much written marking nurseries were doing to begin with. But they all did something similar, replacing written marking with a range of live feedback, with verbal feedback, all very similar strategies. And the impact is really quite strikingly consistent, that they successfully reduced teacher workload with no negative impact on pupil outcomes. In the project that I was involved in, we reduced workload by about 6 hours over the course of a week. And we measured the impact on reading and maths. On writing and maths in that. You can read more about those projects in this publication as well, which is an analysis of all of those projects. And then the second project, the more recent one, was about those wider workload reduction strategies. And this was conducted across 6 regions, this research project. Each region had 6 schools in their cluster, 3 primary, 2 secondary, 1 special. And they used those resources from the Workload toolkit to identify the focus and had lots of case studies to inform their approaches. There were 100 effect sizes from trials, year group replications and other quantitative analyses. The analysis was all done by the Educational Development Trust. At the time, so at March 2020, we had more effects to add. So we got to the sort of publication of the report without having all the data in. That then got put on hold because of COVID. But this was the key finding across the data analysis of all of those different projects. And all of the different effect sizes. The vast majority of studies show no negative effects associated with the workload reduction period. Indeed, overall attainment in participating schools improved during the treatment window. So, of course, we have to take that with a pinch of salt. There are limitations to that research. But we see that for a lot of schools, there was a correlation between reducing workload and improving attainment. We also measured as part of that project teacher happiness and teacher well-being, and we saw across the piece that that teacher well-being and teacher job satisfaction rose for those participating in projects. And there is further information in this study that's got some of the data behind that, further data behind that. So before we move on to that next section, really worth considering workload reduction as part of our retention strategies. So thinking about the working environment, we've thought about the impact of leadership, we've thought about behaviour, we've thought about workload. Something else that comes up around teacher job satisfaction is around teacher autonomy. And that's where we have this report, which again is in the Google Drive, which again was from last year, so all quite recent, around teacher autonomy. How does it relate to job satisfaction and teacher retention? And this was conducted by the NFVR and the Teacher Development Trust. So in this graph, and there are quite a few to choose from, it's comparing teachers' autonomy levels. So 1 is I have no autonomy, 4 is I have a lot of autonomy, with a proportion reporting low job satisfaction. So we can see that where there is low autonomy, we have high numbers of teachers reporting low job satisfaction. And we can see quite a clear trend there that as teacher autonomy improves, so job satisfaction improves. And of course, a word of warning here, while correlation does not necessarily imply a causal relationships, these associations strongly suggest that teacher autonomy is an important influence on job satisfaction and retention. Within this NFER report, there's a really interesting model around motivation and teacher motivation. So take some time to have a look at that, and we can see we've got sort of intrinsic motivation, and extrinsic motivation. So the extrinsic motivation might be things like performance-related pay, it might be around Ofsted, it might be around league tables. And they would suggest, and they've got the evidence basis referred to in that report, that this extrinsic motivation can lead to burnout and stress. We can see improved job performance, but with the associated burnout and stress. And then in the report, they look at intrinsic motivation and they break that down into 3 aspects. We have competence, so the feeling that you are doing a really good job, feeling successful. Relatedness, so how much we collaborate and work with other people. And that's really interesting in the context of us thinking about teacher CPD. We might say that the evidence base for the impact on outcomes of collaboration is weaker than in other areas. But that relatedness is really important to teachers' intrinsic motivation. And so we shouldn't just throw that whole the whole nature of collaborative work out of the window. And then the third pillar of that is around teacher autonomy. And that these 3 together can really build strong intrinsic motivation for teachers, which not only leads to improved job performance, but leads to more satisfaction and retention. So more of a holistic way about thinking about motivation. But of course, when we talk about autonomy, we could be meaning one of many, many different things. And so this is an interesting graph, and this is based on teacher voice data. Which aspects of teacher autonomy are important to people, and what's the change in job satisfaction? So if we look right at the bottom, the more autonomy you have in how your classroom is physically laid out, well, it doesn't have a huge impact on job satisfaction. But if we start to look towards the very top, the most significant change in teacher job satisfaction is associated with an increase in autonomy around teachers setting their own professional development goals. So we've talked a lot in our programme about getting buy-in and motivation, and we're going to be talking about behaviour change. And that's really strongly linked with this. If teachers are going to be involved in setting their professional development goals, of course, we want those to be aligned with our school development priorities as well. So there's really something very important there about how we present and how we share and how we maybe collaboratively agree what those school priorities are. So sharing the data around pupil attainment, sharing the complexities of the cohort and the challenges across the school and across different departments and across different year groups, so that we can allow teachers the autonomy to be involved in their professional development goal setting, but we can ensure that that really aligns with our school development plan and our whole school plans as well. Interesting to pause as well and think about those different aspects of teacher autonomy that are really important to teachers and really linked highly to changes in job satisfaction. So the last aspect of teacher working environment we're going to look at is around flexible working. As we saw, that was one of those barriers was considered to be the lack of adaptability as teachers grow and develop and age over their careers. And we can see that the introduction of the new MPQs, the reformed MPQs, is trying to address some of those alternative career paths and alternative specialisms for teachers, but also having those flexible ways of working. So I think we've talked about TeacherTapp before. It's a great app. If you get it on your phone, it'll pop up at 3:30 every day with 3 multiple choice questions. And as you can see, in January 2020, 3,802 teachers replied to this. So it builds quite an interesting evidence base just to survey teachers on lots of different aspects of school life. So the question posed here is, suppose it's impossible for your boss to refuse a flexible working contract. Which of these working patterns would you choose? And we can see that the largest group would stick with how they are. But we've got a really quite significant group of teachers who've never made this request, 28%, who would be really interested in reducing those hours. Thankfully, the darker purple is quite small. That's teachers who've made a request and have had that refused. But really thinking if we've got all of these teachers who would be happier working flexibly, how can we enable that? How can we support that so that our working environment supports a range of teachers? And I think that links really clearly with a sort of an inclusion and diversity agenda as well, which is that if we want a really diverse and representative teaching workforce, then we've got to give as many different people as possible with different structured family lives, home lives, opportunities for further study, if that's what they want to use the time for, give them the opportunities to be part of the teaching community as well. And that's going to build a sort of better richness and a more diverse population. So we've looked at a range of teacher retention strategies. I hope that was useful. All of the further reading referred to here is in the Google Drive. And I look forward to seeing you at our next session. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.